Quality of content that has happened so far. So I really appreciate you all being here. I'm really pleased to call many of the women on this panel friends. Brianna is the only person I hadn't met until today, and I'm sure that we'll be in touch
be friends from now
forward.
on. Yeah.
Yes, friends for life. So I wanted to have this conversation because I read an article by Eleanor Burkett, which I believe many people in this room are familiar with, which really challenged the notion of what a woman meant in today's world. And it pissed a lot of people off, understandably. And I think it was the catalyst for something that really invited a multitude of perspectives on how we identify and what that means today. So each of these wonderful people are going to give a very brief and succinct introduction of who they are and what they do in the world. And if they would like to share with you how they identify for the sake of this conversation, they're welcome to throw that in there as well. So Elise, I will start with you.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. My name is Elise Peterson. I am a writer. I write a sex column for Adult Mag, amongst other publications. I also am a visual artist and an educator working with middle school and high school students, and I am a woman.
Hi, these are on, right? I'm Kimberly Reed. I'm a filmmaker. About 5 years ago, I made a film called Prodigal Sons, which is a personal documentary about me going back to my home in Montana and kind of coming out as trans for the first time. That seems, even though it was just 5 years ago, that seems like light years ago in terms of just the cultural attention to trans issues. I think that's right now I'm also producing another film. It's about some early gender nonconforming activists who started some of the first trans rights, gender nonconforming groups. It's about Sylvia Rivera and Marsha P. Johnson and the friendship between the two of them.
Hi, my name is Ashley Ford. I write for Elle and some other places, all over the place. I edit for Matter and a little website called Design Sponge. And I'm co-editing an anthology on rape culture with my friend and mentor, Roxanne Gay. And that's and I teach writing. I think one of my students is here. Emma, are you here? Hey, Emma. I was assigned the gender girl at birth, and I just kind of continue to rock with that. And I think that's pretty much it.
Cool. Hey, my name is Brianna Wu. I'm head of development at Giant Space Cat. I'm a software engineer, and my day job is being an entrepreneur. I take a lot of pride in the number of women I employ at my studio. Game dev is kind of a very famously sexist industry, and we're trying to turn the tide around. But what is kind of frustrating for me sometimes is I'm much more well-known for my work in feminism than I am my professional career as an entrepreneur and engineer. And that really happened because I just couldn't be silent about the way women are treated in our field. It's abhorrent. A lot of people got to know me this year with Gamergate and the hundreds of death threats that I received because of that. They made a terrible Law and Order episode about it. So that's who I am. And I also identify as a woman.
Amazing. So for the people in the room who aren't familiar with the article that was in the New York Times, I just wanted to read a very quick excerpt to give you sort of a frame for what prompted this conversation, and then I'm going to ask a question. So she says, their truth is not my truth, and she's speaking about the trans community. Their truth is not my truth. Their female identities are not my female identity. They haven't traveled the world as women and been shaped by all that this entails. They haven't suffered through business meetings with men talking to their breasts or woken up after sex terrified they'd forgotten to take their birth control pills the day before. They hadn't had to cope with the onset of their periods in the middle of a crowded subway, the humiliation of discovering that their male work partner's checks were far larger than theirs, or the fear of being too weak to ward off rapists. For me and many women, feminist and otherwise, one of the most difficult parts of witnessing and wanting to rally behind the movement for transgender rights is the language that a growing number of trans individuals insist on, the notions of femininity that they're articulating, and their disregard for the fact that being a woman means having accrued certain experiences, endured certain indignities, and relished certain courtesies in a culture that reacted to you as one. So, a pretty powerful perspective, and hurtful to a lot of people. It was incredibly divisive. And so I think the question that we're going to start with is, as genders become more expansive, will the concept of woman continue to exist? And if so, what will it mean, and who gets to decide? And Brianna, I know you had some strong feelings about that, so let's start with you.
Absolutely. I want to address that article super quickly and say, transgender women did not choose to not get those experiences. If everything was equal, transgender women would have vastly, vastly preferred to have been raised in the gender that they felt most comfortable with. And in fact, it's cisgender oppression there's the reason why transgender women sometimes haven't accrued that. But transgender women do eventually get those experiences. You understand what discrimination is, not getting paid as much, being talked over in meetings, practically everything that you just listed. Transgender women do experience that. So I think it's just a ridiculously hurtful thing to say. But as far as your question, is there going to come a time where the phrase woman is kind of non-important? I don't know. I think something I've really kind of marveled at this year is the explosion of non-binary issues. It's something I honestly had not thought a lot about until this year. And by non-binary, I mean people that don't closely identify as one gender or another. They find gender uncomfortable and kind of eschew traditional gender roles. I think it's really important as we're talking about this to keep one perspective in mind. I'm sure everyone here in this room today has had the experience of a dude walking up to you and talking about feminist issues like it's a fun academic thing. Like they have no skin in the game. It's like just an academic theoretical to them. And I would say with all respect to some feminists that kind of pose this question, and it's not just the New York Times article, it's been others lately. Some cisgendered feminists I've seen kind of do the same thing to trans women, kind of like, well, gender is just kind of amorphous. We don't know what it means. And it kind of forces transgender women to defend their identity and their experiences. Is that kind of academic removal from that that's very, very hurtful to address on a constant basis. So I think that we are going to have more people being a gender or, not identifying as a woman. But in the meantime, I think it's really important to respect transgender women's experiences.
Thank you. Ashley,
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your thoughts, and we'll just come down the line on this question.
Well, first of all, in regards to the article, I could find that article really hurtful just from a physical perspective, in that, I have a condition, I don't really get periods, it's not really something that happens, or when I do, it's always like shocking, and it happens like once every 2 years or something like that. Fertility and things like that are still a question for me. So when womanhood is equated to those things, I think it is both unfair to women who don't experience those things, who were assigned gender of woman at birth, or a female at birth. And I also think, well, female's a sex, but whatever. We'll get into that later. I also think, as far as gender, I think the problem, the discussion of labels in general, is sort of symptomatic and not causal. I think that labels should be important to a person, and how people choose to identify should be respected. I don't think anyone else should ever get to decide how someone else identifies. And I think that when we sort of get away from this addiction we have for certainty, when it comes to gender or gender identity, and not our own certainty, but our certainty that we want to be able to look at someone else and not have a moment of confusion, or not have a moment where we don't quite understand, or not have to ask the question, or be comfortable with the fact that it's not our place to ask the question and we can just keep it moving and treat that person like a person. I think that's kind of like the only way I see the conversation of gender, gender expression, and gender identity evolving in this world, is sort of getting rid of that addiction that we have to know and we should know and we have a right to know someone else's identification. If they want you to know, they'll tell you. So yeah.
I think that's great. And I just wanted to also, Kim, get your perspective, because I feel like you've been fighting on the front lines of these issues for a really long time. I saw an episode of you on Oprah many, many years ago, and I'm sure your perspective of what this term means and the sort of nomenclature around womanhood, I'm sure is a really interesting thing for you to witness as we are suddenly looking at the trans movement in a much more crystallized way.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to echo a lot of what, I've heard up here. I read that initial New York Times article in the same way, and I found it offending, because that in that long list, their truth is not my truth list, 1, 2, 3, everything on that list had happened to me. And I feel like my identity as female it has been constituted, it has been constructed by those experiences. That is my lived experience. So for her to try to predetermine my gender, to put labels on me that I'm not self-defining, I think is what a lot of trans people and cis people as well found really offensive by that story. I do, and maybe this is even a little controversial, but I reread that article again, and I hadn't read it for a long time. And it was interesting to me because where she started out was, I think, a really respectable position. And that was that what is happening, it was all in reaction to Caitlyn Jenner coming out. And her reaction was that I've fought so long as a feminist to keep the world from being this overly polarized, essentialist world where people are telling me that you're a woman, you have ovaries, therefore you will be treated this way and paid half as much, and a long list of indignities, as she says. And she started in this point, and I think went really off the rails. And what her initial argument before it went off the rails was that if Caitlyn Jenner is going to force us into that same overly polarized essentialist argument, that's what she was initially arguing against. And I do find a lot that is salvageable in that point, because I think it's something that probably everybody in this room contends with. I found it very interesting that just yesterday, an article in the Washington Post came out. I don't know how many people saw it, but there's a new study in Israel. 1,400 MRIs were scanned in a new way to analyze whether there really is a male brain and a female brain. And they basically said, those poles still exist, but mashups and mosaics are much more common than anybody realized before. And that really resonated with me because it's my lived experience with gender. I don't know which came first, whether my experience sort of formed my brain one way, or whether, chicken egg, who knows? But I know that's how I feel most comfortable operating in the world. That's how I've identified for a long, long time. And I think that, as long as we stay focused on how people are self-identifying and not trying to impose gender or any of the other, oppressions that we find in our society, instead of forcing that on other people, that's where we really need to stay focused.
So I think that's an interesting point, and I'm actually going to transition slightly, Elise, before you answer, because you and I were speaking the other night, and I was mentioning an interview that I'd seen you do, and you were talking about a collage that you'd made about Assata Shakur, and you said, we impose so much on her, having her be strong and resilient all the time. She's a strong black woman, and sure, that narrative is very true, but we're also so much more than that. And to me, it really made me think about this panel and this conversation, because I think the narratives that are imposed on people when they identify as something can be incredibly challenging. So I wanted to hear your perspective on what you think people project onto you or don't when you talk about how you identify. And I think that's also an interesting segue into another thing we were talking about earlier, so feel free to speak to either of these, everyone, which is it your job, if you're a writer or if you're working in the field or if you're an activist in any way, to bring people along the journey? So essentially, if you're sharing your identity with the world, are you suddenly then responsible for bringing people along, for explaining to them what it means, for helping them navigate it? I think both of those things are questions that are really relevant given the current climate.
Whoa. All right. So I think first in regard to identity and what is imposed on our identity, I will say there's a lot in the Eleanor Burkett piece that resonated with me. And I think that in regard to how we self-identify, one, I can only speak, and I will only speak from my personal perspective. I won't make sweeping generalizations about women, about trans women, about anyone. I'll speak about Elise. But for me, what terrifies me in regard to the state of woman and womanhood is other people, whatever that means, imposing what it means to be a woman. I was born a woman. I am a woman. Because someone else's experience and her womanhood differs from mine doesn't mean that they then impose certain terminology on what my womanhood means. So I'm not a cis woman, I'm a woman. And there doesn't need to be a term for who I am or what I am because someone else is grappling with or discovering or carving out their space in this world and how they identify. I don't think that should then affect how I identify. So those are some of the terminology and what resonated with me, and what I think Eleanor Burkett was kind of talking about is one person's experience doesn't need to be imposed on another. So I think that's where the piece resonated. And I'm sorry, what was the other? There's been so much said.
Yeah, so I think the other question was, for instance, I'll give an example.
Yeah.
I know Ashley is someone who wrote a really beautiful piece about why she identifies as queer. Mm-hmm. And what that means to her.
Right.
I've also worked with a number of friends and allies who have a strong identity that, for instance, an example would be Janet Mock, obviously wrote a fantastic book about her experience, but she is also a staunch believer that it's not her job to bring everyone with her. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a sort of murkiness there about where your independent identity begins and ends in relation to your job as an educator and as an advocate. So maybe, Ashley, do you want to speak to that?
Oh, sure. I talk about what I want to talk about. I don't necessarily think that it's ever my job to educate people. I think it's also my prerogative when a conversation starts and when a conversation ends. If I start a conversation with someone, or if someone engages me and I choose to engage with them, it is not suddenly my job or my responsibility to see this conversation through to the end. There have been quite a few times where I've begun a conversation with someone in good faith about queer identity, about bisexuality, about my identification as a black woman, only to have them say something so foundationally dumb that I very quickly realized we were not having the same conversation. And I think that happens often. that you start a conversation with someone in good faith or engage them when they engage you, and then very quickly find out that you're not having the same conversation. It's not that I need you to agree with me. It's just that there's some basic information that when I talk to you, I'm informed with, that I'm trying to build on that basic information. And if you're not there, like I don't have, to be perfectly honest, the patience to continue to have this conversation at that level, especially if I don't know you or love you. You know, my mother and my grandmother, we have a lot of conversations, you know, or my grandmother who just passed, we had a lot of conversations about gender and identity and about sexuality, and I was happy to sit and talk and engage and explain and do those things because those women raised me. But you're just a person sometimes on the internet, and I'm busy. I'm a writer. I'm an editor. I am trying to change the entire fucking world. Yeah. So I like, there are just some places where I don't have the time or the energy to go with you. And I very much agree with Elise that the way other people identify should not have to change the way I identify. If I choose to call myself a cis woman, fine. I don't have to call myself a cis woman. But I also don't particularly find offense when I'm referred to as a cis woman, because I also feel like when a trans woman refers to me as a cis woman, what she is essentially doing is making the point that my identifying as a woman does not mean that my experience is indicative of all womanhood and that there's only one way to be a woman. Yeah. So I get that. And so I don't necessarily take offense when I'm referred to that way, even if I don't choose to refer to myself that way.
So Brianna and Kim, I'd love to hear your perspective as well. And Ashley, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
No problem.
I would love to hear your perspectives as well, because one of the things we were discussing outside was when we choose to use certain labels for ourselves, right? So there are times when we walk into a room and we want to lead with certain things, and there are times when we walk into a room and we would rather just be who we are without explanation. So, and I think that plays directly into when we do own something, suddenly there is there is a stigma, for better or for worse, as to whatever that person associates with that word that is suddenly projected on us. Do you want to speak, both of you, to that?
Yeah, I'd love to. Well, I want to say first to you, like, you can't educate everyone. Like, there has to be a point where you disconnect. Like, I've tried so hard, and there's a certain point where your brain just short circuits and you can't do it anymore. So I'm always fine with declining to have that conversation. You know, I do want to give you a little bit of friendly pushback. Like, feminism's a big tent. We can all have different opinions here. I want everyone here to imagine trying to have a conversation about Black Lives Matters, where a white person was sitting there saying, you know what, I just don't like being labeled as a white person, so can we not do that? Or like trying to have a conversation about, you know, LGBT rights. And, you know, the conversations conservatives sometimes have, well, you know, I just don't want this discussed in schools, period. It's just not really that important. You know, the term cis is a very functional term. And maybe this is because, you know, my bias is pragmatism. I'm an engineer. I am very interested in putting ideas into practice and reality. And it's a term, I think, that's asking cisgender people to stop, wait a beat, and consider their privilege, which is ample. I mean, if you look at the stats of what happened to transgender women in our society, it's horrific. I've had 9 transgender friends commit suicide in my life, and I'm in my mid-30s. You know, there are stories every day about transgender women being murdered, about transgender women being put in the wrong jail facility and being murdered. So I do have to give you a little bit of pushback on that term cis. It's not meant to be hurtful. It's meant to ask you to consider privilege. And I think for intersectional feminists, which I hope all of us here are, we all are in the interest of checking our privilege. I have to do it with ableism. I have to do it with racial issues. You know, this is good for all of us to think through these issues. As far as imposing an identity from the outside, again, maybe this is because I'm an engineer. I don't necessarily have an issue with it. I think that, you know, for me, that lived experience in the game industry in particular, that does drive what I care about, what I think about. If you look at the games we put out, they have a huge emotional bent. So I personally don't have any problem with that.
So 2 quick points of clarification.
Sure.
So, correct me, I want to make
Please,
sure
please,
that I'm
please.
hearing you correctly,
Absolutely.
because I wasn't entirely sure when you were saying you wanted to push back on this. Do you feel that in order for someone to recognize their own privilege as it relates to sexuality and gender,
Yeah.
they need to identify publicly as cis?
Oh, God, no. I'm saying, but I am saying that terminology. I've heard a lot of pushback this year from cisgender people that say, I don't want to be called cisgender. They consider it a slur. And I think it's a term meant to check people's privilege. But as far as having to declare that publicly, absolutely not.
I mean, I don't think that cisgender necessarily is a slur. It's just not applicable to me. It doesn't, it's not something that resonates with me, so therefore I don't need to be referred to it. And if there is a place in which I can stand on privilege, I will. As a black woman, I'm at a disadvantage a lot.
Sure.
And so if there's a space in which I have some privilege, I'm going to take it.
Sure.
So I'm a woman. I'm a black woman. I'm not a cis woman. I'm a black woman. If another woman who was born a woman or assigned a gender as woman at birth wants to be identified as cis, that's totally her prerogative. And I have no issue with that. But what I'm saying is that I think that me identifying as a woman is not discrediting your experience as a woman. It is affirming my experience,
Sure.
my life as a
Sure.
woman. So I think that it's important just to kind of, to me, it's important to respect that one person, how they identify, is not discrediting something else. And I kind of want to go back to your analogy in regard to Black Lives Matter, and maybe if you could just expand upon that. I wasn't quite sure how it related to this conversation.
Sure, and maybe I'm misinterpreting your point, but the way I heard that is like you would prefer, you don't like that label cis, and I think...
For me, yes.
For you, okay. Maybe I interpreted it incorrectly as a whole, but I was talking about like, sometimes one of the first rules of a privileged class erasing the other class is like white people, and I'm white, saying, oh, I just don't see race, right? It's just not a helpful conversation to have. So that is why I feel like the terms cisgender and transgender are very important, and non-binary for that matter.
Well, and I think one of the things we talked about earlier, right, is choice, and
Right.
that's where we started talking about this, which is when it's what identity do each of us at any point want to bring into a room, and also acknowledging that, this is another thing that we were going to get to, acknowledging that they're ever changing, acknowledging that everything is fluid, acknowledging that one day you feel one way and one day you feel a certain way, and so honoring that each of us have the ability to choose and to acknowledge and to affirm each of those things in our own space and our own time is really important. And Kim, I know, again, as someone who's been working on these issues for a very long time, I'm sure it's been interesting to see the cultural dialogue shift in such a significant way around gender and sexuality.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, it's also really a question about what's the most effective way to get this point across. And sometimes I think it's good to have that label on your forehead and to grab that issue by the throat, and to really discuss that issue as an issue with somebody else. And hopefully, we can do that in a strategic and constructive way that moves us all forward. Sometimes what works best for me as a storyteller in film and the Moth and operas and just telling stories about this is that for me, at the end of the day, whether we're talking about any of these different classes of distinction, is that we're just trying to recognize the humanity that's underneath all these different labels. Male, female, black, white. That class is a really important issue that a lot of us don't talk about nearly enough. And for me, a lot of times, the best way to do that is to introduce the issue, to sort of walk in the room with that label on your forehead, and then do everything you can to make people forget about it as soon as possible, so that they're really just understanding these underlying human issues that are going on. And then, if you can get people to a point where they're just seeing you as a human being, then you can start putting that issue back on the table and say, you forgot about that we were dealing with this or that we were dealing with that. That is not always possible, to just make people forget about it. But I think that in these conversations that we have, that the closer we can get to just pushing people into recognizing the underlying humanity of this person sitting across the table or the conversation or in a movie theater or reading Elle magazine, that's what it's really about for me.
One of the other things that I was thinking about when preparing for this panel and reading different things and watching different things that each of you had participated in was I was reading an interview that Elise did with Refinery 29, and they said, describe yourself in one phrase, and she said, Black in Brooklyn. And last night we were chatting about that, and I said, I'd never really thought before about if there was a hierarchy of identities. Is there a reason that you said Black in Brooklyn versus gay in Brooklyn, or an artist in Brooklyn, and she said that she believed there were a hierarchy of identities, and I thought that was really fascinating, and I was just wondering if each of you could sort of speak to if you agree, and what are your general thoughts on that, and would you like to share your hierarchy? But I think it's a really interesting premise because it comes back to, or perhaps they're fluid as well.
There might be hierarchies, but I think that the hierarchy changes. I think that in a room full of other Black people, my hierarchies change. In a room full of other Black people, which happens way, way, way too rarely, I am much more, depending on how I'm dressed, depending on the conversation that I'm having, I'm probably much, much more aware of my queerness or my womanhood in a room full of Black people. I think in a room full of white people, I am much more aware of my Blackness. In a room full of queer people, I'm much more aware of my Blackness. In a room full of men, I am much more aware of being a woman. It just like all of these things, it's not necessarily that in my identity, anything really, sits on top of anything else. The way we think of hierarchies is like as steps, but I would say depending on the room I'm in, there are definitely hierarchies, and they change, and how people react to me changes, and how I react to them changes too.
Yeah, I think all those intersections are constantly shifting depending on the environment that we find ourselves in.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say also, to piggyback off of that, it definitely changes depending on the space on a micro level in terms of like the room that I'm in, and then on a macro level in regard to the state of society and the state of the world that we're living in right now. And I think that's why I decided to put Black in Brooklyn, because I think right now as Black people, we are under attack. And so therefore, before anything, I sit in this room and I look for all the Black faces. That's the first thing I did when I came in here, because that's where I'm at. And those are the people that I'm going to connect with, I hope. I hope, before anything else, because we have a certain experience that differs so much more from my experience as a woman, that differs so much from my experience as a gay woman. And so at this point, because of the state of society and probably how it's going to be for a long time, unfortunately, being Black kind of sits on a higher level of hierarchy. But you're right, in regard to the space that I'm in, if I'm in a room full of women, I'm going to look for the Black person. If I'm in a room full of white people,
Yeah.
it's the Black
I think on a macro level, though, my hierarchy of Black and woman are definitely at the top, but I think they shift constantly, because on one day I am so infuriated at the fact that I'm thinking about police brutality, and I'm thinking about our inability, not even our inability, because it's definitely, I think, out of our hands. But the fact that we continue to ask for and fight for justice and continue to be rebuffed, and then this thing happens at Planned Parenthood, and I'm feeling very much a woman. And I'm, on the internet seeing Black men say things like, Black women should never be at a Planned Parenthood anyway, because you killing young Black kings and queens and stuff like that. And I'm like, get the fuck out of here. You know what I mean? It's very, so I think, I totally understand what you're saying, and I do think that, my Blackness most of the time, probably at a macro level, is at the top. But lately, with watching what's happened with Planned Parenthood, is like, it's not just Planned Parenthood.
Right.
And I think I forget that a lot.
Well, and I think it's not just it's not necessarily about race and gender either. I mean, I know, Brianna, one of the things that you talked about was how you feel like your gender is something that's more notable to people rather than the career that you have or the things that you've
Absolutely.
accomplished. So
Yeah.
I think that's part of it too. And
Yeah.
I'd love for you to share your experience with that.
Yeah, no, it's very frustrating. This is a constant thing that happens to women in the video game industry. If you're a video game journalist and you work at any of the big publications, you can expect your identity as a woman to lead to you reviewing Just Dance, My Diary, and all those kinds of games. You know, it's forced upon you, and it's because it's that otherness. Again, right, like you were talking about being black and like looking around the room and feeling that way. The loneliest I ever felt in my entire life was at WWDC last year, which is the really big Apple developer event in San Francisco. So I go to the Bash, which is this huge party, and there were probably about 4,000 people there, and there were about 8 women. So you better believe that I really felt that identity at that point. I wanted to say this, though. I think there's the inverse of this identity that's very, very much thinking about. I don't know about everyone else here, but 2015 is a year where I've spent a lot of time thinking about my privilege. With Black Lives Matter, I think about white privilege every day in ways that I haven't before. I think about being able-bodied. I think about having English as a first language as I work in this country. I think about all these identities that do give me an advantage here. So I think that it is a good thing to like take the inverse of that function, to kind of think about your thinking, because it makes you a better person to kind of check those identities.
Well, it comes back to intersectionality too, which I know, Kim, you'd made a point of wanting to speak about, and I would love to dive into that a little bit deeper. And one of the things that had been said to me recently by a very prominent trans activist was that she felt as though the LGBT community was not very welcoming or supportive of lesbians and also women of color who identified as lesbians. And I was curious if anyone agreed with that, if they could speak to why they thought that was, because that actually, not only in terms of intersectionality, but in terms of class and in terms of privilege, made a lot of sense to me, in the sense that I feel like we don't talk in an inclusive enough way about these issues, and we don't invite other voices into the conversation as often as we should. And even when we look at popular culture, I think historically white gay men have sort of been the story that's been told. And I think that's really unfortunate. So how do we shift that, and how do we talk about that? How do we create a more open dialogue and acknowledge all of the voices that are within this community? Ashley, does that not resonate with you? You look puzzled.
No, I'm sorry, my face, I'm thinking
Has a
things and
life
my
of its
face
own.
moves before I finish the thought. No, it absolutely resonates with me. The LGBTQA community is not immune to the effects of systemic racism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. No one, they're not above it. We're not above it. As someone who identifies as queer and bisexual, I just, like it is very evident to me, you know, that people, when it comes to like black lesbians, and when it comes to black women who identify as queer, when it comes to lesbians in general, so often we are an afterthought in this community. And I don't think that that's new, and I don't think that that's necessarily, that it's particularly bad in the LGBT community, except for the fact that I think people just expect better from people who identify that way. We expect more. We think, oh, you must, because you identify this way, you must be more enlightened, you know, whatever. But I tell you, some of the most racist things I've ever heard have come out of gay white men's mouths.
Yeah.
And some of the most
transphobic.
sexist things, and transphobic,
Yep.
and
Yep.
some of the worst things I've ever heard about women have come out of their mouth. Like it's, and you know, sometimes there are very real boundary issues because sometimes gay men have a really hard time especially gay white men, have a really hard time accepting the fact that you are still a man and you can't just touch my body because you're not thinking of me in a so-called sexual way. It's still my body,
Yeah.
you know? So
Yeah, a lot of times there's like, tell me if you feel this way too, but a problem with like over-identification or over like celebrating in a way that like, I'm gonna celebrate your fabulousness in a way that is just wrong. Like they're just not getting who I am. A lot of times it has to do with a complete misunderstanding of the separation between drag and putting on gender as a show versus, you know, someone who really identifies as being trans. That happens all the time.
Yeah.
And I think,
Sorry, go ahead.
excuse me, what we also, I think, forget or fail to make the distinction of is that LGBTQA, okay, we keep adding letters, I just want to make sure.
We do keep adding letters.
That we are all grouped together as an other to heterosexuality. So all of us now are expected to now coexist and have, maybe not coexist, but have the same aim in how we move and our same goals as a community. And we've been clumped together as a community when maybe we don't have the same aspirations as people. You know, me being a lesbian woman does not mean that I'm looking for the same justices as anyone else on this particular panel, just because we all are not straight or we all are not a part of the norm, this white heterosexual norm. And so I wanted to bring that point to light, is that we've now been grouped together as this other, and for me, it doesn't always feel like it fits. You know, I don't understand what a gay white male experience is. I don't understand a trans experience. Well, am I open to learning? Sure, but just because that's one person's experience, now we've all been grouped together and expected to understand and be on the same page.
I thought that was such a powerful insight. You shared that with me last night, and I thought it was a really powerful insight because I think it's something we can all relate to. I mean, especially in the feminist community, we really talk about how many feminisms there are, and we each have our own perspective and our own way of owning that word. Yet, as Ashley was saying earlier, and Brianna, you as well, when people engage you and they want to talk about these issues, they assume that there is like a constitution of feminism that we can all recite that's going to explain everything to everybody. And it's really hard to understand how to communicate values and at the same time articulate that how you interpret those values is incredibly unique to yourself.
Absolutely.
It is. I mean, and it's just a little bit of study. You know, it takes some study. It takes some thinking about my experience and then thinking about the fact that my experience is not the singular experience. And then trying to, I mean, Google is free. Like you read about other experiences, you have conversations, you watch the interviews, you know what I mean? Like representation is important, and we don't have enough representation of different kinds of stories, different kinds of trans stories, different kinds of gender identifying stories. You know, like we need to be telling a lot of different stories because people are paying attention, and that is how we study. That is how I think it is part of how we learn empathy. And that study is an essential part of being an ally. And I know a lot of people, you know, don't like the word ally anymore. And the reason that they don't like the word ally anymore is because people started using it as an identifier instead of as a verb. People started thinking of ally as something that I put on so that I can no longer be criticized, instead of a doorway, and saying that, like, because I call myself an ally and because I am committed to the act of allyship, the doorway that I'm opening is one for critique because I want to be better. And I want to be empathetic, and I want to live a full experience of humanity and sort of relating and connecting to my fellow human beings. But, you know, it's the same problem with, you know, men who openly identify as feminists, but then do very misogynistic things and say very misogynistic things because they think that by wearing the label, they don't have to do the work. And you have to do the study. You have to do the work.
I'm just completely in awe of all of you, and you're my friends, and I'm still just stunned at everyone's incredible perspective. I want to circle back to allies in just a second because I do think that is such an important part of this conversation, especially as we all go back out into the world today. But I wanted to touch briefly on something that we just started talking about, which is white privilege and patriarchy. And I'm curious what people's thoughts are on whether or not Caitlyn Jenner's former self, Bruce Jenner, I'm unclear how to say that, so I'm sure this is an excellent teachable moment for someone to tell me that
It's
I
Caitlyn Jenner.
misspoke. Okay,
Yeah.
Caitlyn
Yeah.
Jenner. If her story was so well received or able to break into the narrative that has really affected our culture in the way that it has because of who she is.
Yeah. I would love to answer that. I want to just back up for 1 second and go back to the queer identity issue. I don't know how to say this other than to just say this directly and honestly, and that is the LGBT community is failing at including transgender and non-binary people. They're utterly failing. It's not that a lot of trans voices are not included there, it's that they are actively being, they're actively experiencing very hostile things. You know, cisgender gay men can be ridiculously sexist and transphobic. Just look at Milo over at Breitbart, right? Like that dude has some issues. So I just want to say, we've talked so much this year about this, and I guess my message would be, if you are in the LGBT community, I would really ask you to educate yourself, because there are choices that are being made every day that do immense harm and add to these ridiculous suicide rates, these joblessness rates, these poverty rates. But coming back around to, what was your question one more time? I was talking about, yes?
It was about privilege and white privilege and the patriarchy. And if, we talked about how, from what I've experienced, in pop culture, we've historically seen white gay men as the archetype for what a gay couple looks like. And yes, we're moving away from that now, but I think that's where we all started, and that was the touchdown for many of our relationships.
Caitlyn Jenner.
So moving into current day, we have this prominent cultural figure who transitions, and is there something to who she is that was able to open a door, and what does that say, and what does that mean?
Sure. So something I would really ask everyone here, the cisgender, to understand is Caitlyn Jenner is going through something right now that's very, very predictable. There's a phenomenon when transgender people transition, they don't have that lived experience, right? So they incorrectly think that being a woman means dresses and makeup and all this stuff that just doesn't matter. And all of us here know that. That's a lesson that she's going to learn in 5 years and 10 years. Right now she's basically having to experience her teenage years in the public eye on Keeping Up with the Kardashians. And believe me, a lot of mistakes are being made, not the first of which is voting Republican. So, she has a lot of work to do, and I know a lot of people in the transgender community are very frustrated with her kind of being the spokeswoman for their experience. So it's a train wreck. It's a public train wreck. I don't know how else to say it.
She's going through puberty for the second time, and we're all watching it on the Kardashians.
Yeah.
And it's like, at the end of the, I got kind of caught in the middle of some of this, of kind of, really early on when some of those first magazine covers came out, just kind of speculating what Caitlyn would look like. I had to jump in and say, let's just wait. This is all about how somebody identifies themselves. Just wait. And then there was the Diane Sawyer thing where Caitlyn was saying, I'm trans, but I want you to use male pronouns, which was, I think, more of a PR ploy than anything else that was really confusing. And then now we're not watching another confusing situation. So I think that the most important thing at the end of the day is that we all know somebody who's trans, and maybe this is going to help. And I have to say that part of me is glad that this is happening on such a big level. But man, it's a really awkward thing to be watching. And
it's
I mean, for
terrible.
me, it's like grabbing a 13-year-old boy at his bar mitzvah and like kind of shaking him, saying, "Tell us what it's like to be an adult now," right there on the stage of the bar mitzvah. It's just she's not going to have any of this experience, and in some ways it's good that we're all watching it. In some ways it's really misleading, if for no other reason than
Well, I
because
think
she's Republican.
I'm sorry, but I think some of the frustration lies in the fact that she has the privilege of having this platform because she
That
is
was
white.
my question.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so would
Absolutely.
a Janet Mock be able to have that same privilege had she first started her transition in front of the world? Would we care that she was making the same mistakes? Would we give her such leeway that she was making some of the same really sweeping generalizations about womanhood had she been white?
Yeah.
And so I think that's where the frustration lies, and that no one's upset that Caitlyn Jenner is going through her transition and learning herself and making mistakes and maybe making some silly goof ups in public about womanhood is chipped nail polish versus having nail polish on all the time. It's that she's sitting down with Diane Sawyer because she is a white woman in a place of power and a place of financial status.
Sure.
And I think that's the issue, and that's where I think a lot of people's frustration lies. It's not her experience, it's not her transition, it's that we're sitting here talking about it because she's a Jenner.
I would challenge you to find any transgender person on the entire planet that would rather Caitlyn Jenner be the high-profile person for transgender people versus Janet Mock or, I'm forgetting the actress from Orange is the New Black, like
Laverne
anyone
Cox.
else. Yes. She's not good.
Yeah.
She's not good. And like the Halloween thing, she's doing so much active harm. Like, there was that Halloween costume that came out that's basically making fun of transgender people.
Yeah.
And she's like, it doesn't bother me. And then when she says that, it harms every other transgender woman that doesn't have that privilege and is actively a joke every single day. And she's failing.
We're
And
talking
that
about
also has to do with and that's tough for me because I understand there's a certain responsibility or at least like a certain criticism that you have made yourself available to when you are a certain level of notorious or infamous or famous or whatever. Like I very much understand that. At the same time, I do think we tend to ask a lot of people for being rich and visible that I'm not always comfortable with. I'm not comfortable sometimes with sort of demanding people be more perfect because they have more. But I do think those people have opened themselves up to that criticism, and they have opened themselves up to being the center of those conversations. That is something that they do have to live with, and that is something that's okay. I do think it is a worthy conversation to have about what we ask of people for having what we don't, whether that be platform, whether that be money, whether that be visibility, whatever it is. I think sometimes, not necessarily that we ask too much, but definitely that we ask some really unexamined and perhaps superficial things because we stop seeing people as humans and start seeing them as ideas. And we start thinking, I don't agree with the idea of that person, and so I'm going to challenge them like they don't have blood running through their veins, and like they don't cry at night, and like they don't have like all these different experiences in the world.
I think it's a yes and though, right? I think it's a yes and because it comes back to, yes, I absolutely agree that we expect a lot, if not too much, of those people. And I also think icon toppling is a very big thing in our culture where we love to build people up and then tear them down.
Yes.
But I also think there is an important distinction between if you are a notable, visible, rich person with a platform who privately chooses to go through something in your life that has to do with gender or sexuality versus if you are going to have a television show about your transition.
Right.
And I think that in that case, and I have to say, I do appreciate some of the conversations that she allowed to be shown to the public. I thought that really spoke to what I took to be a sincere and authentic approach to the story she wanted to tell. But it reminds me, I've done a lot of work around campus sexual assault, and this is a strange analogy, I know, so people can tell me if I'm crazy, but it reminds me when we're talking about campus sexual assault, and so many people said this is such a missed opportunity to talk about sexual assault writ large, right? To talk about sexual assault and intersectionality, to talk about sexual assault in all of its many forms. It's important to talk about campus sexual assault, yes, but there are all these other things. Similarly, I think it's a larger opportunity to talk about all of the voices that aren't being included.
Absolutely.
And so I think for me, that's what I hope she continues to do as she moves through this process. But speaking of Janet Mock, who's come up a lot, I wanted to mention recently I was listening to Lena Dunham's new podcast, Woman of the Hour, which Ashley is featured on and is incredible, and her voice on the podcast just kills me every time. But Lena's sister Grace is interviewing Janet Mock, and Janet is talking about when she was younger, before she transitioned, how she would sew shoulder pads into her clothes because she wanted to seem curvier, and to her that was the look that she wanted. And Grace said that the act of sewing shoulder pads into her clothes in and of itself was activism. And I thought that was such a powerful thought, and it's something that I've been thinking about, and I wanted to know, do each of you think that, especially with the climate around these issues, what it is right now, for better or for worse, right? So we've seen some really powerful things in the last year, but we've also seen some really terrible things in the last year, like trans women being targeted and murdered.
Yeah.
But
Especially trans women of color. It's
Yeah.
just, it's an
Especially
epidemic.
Yeah, so the question is self-actualization activism? Elise.
I will say, unfortunately, yes. I hate the idea that being one's authentic true self is then a revolutionary act, because that should be the norm. But as we know, we live in a society that really truly does not condone authenticity. We like the idea of it, but we don't like it when it's sitting in our living room. And from my own personal experience, I went home this Thanksgiving break. I'm a teacher, so I had a little break off. And I had to come out to my dad. And that in itself, that is an activism. It's a revolutionary moment when you're sitting in the car with your father and having to tell your father that you're gay, and him being like, but you're so pretty, And so these are very real moments in which it is a revolutionary activist moment, because I'm taking the time and the space to be able to educate and hopefully inform and hopefully shift the idea of what a group of people look like, because now that group of people has been humanized, because that group of people is your daughter, it's your sister, it's your cousin, it's your granddaughter. So yes, I think self-actualization is activism, and I would love in my lifetime, in my children's lifetime, for it to not be.
I'd love to just go down the line on this. Ken?
Yeah, it's just, I think we always need to make the personal political and do everything we can at every level to make statements.
I think that activism and sometimes radicalism and also is just about the shedding of privilege and power. And so when you stand in an identity, especially one that makes you less safe in the world, by saying, most of the time when you're black, it's already been shed for you. There's no deciding to shed your race privilege. It's like, no, we know. But when you come out to your father as gay or as lesbian, when you come out to people, one of the things that I struggled with was, do I get to come out to people as queer when I am in a long-term relationship with a cis man? Do I get to do that? Even though I know my identity, even though I know that, I'm attracted to women and trans women, does that change what I get to tell people about myself? Also, do I want to? That's the thing a lot of people won't admit to sometimes. Like, a lot of people will say, well, I don't know that, like, the LGBT community will really accept me because I'm in this heteronormative relationship. And a lot of times that's bullshit. The real problem is I am shedding a certain privilege by identifying this way. I am giving up power by identifying that way, and that's what makes it activism, and that's what makes it radical. Anytime you put yourself out there, anytime, as the true expression of yourself, and that expression of yourself includes a marginalized aspect, that is activism. You are doing something radical. When you are a bigger woman and you call yourself beautiful, that is radical. Because there are people who honestly, and it sounds like out in the universe, like, no, that wouldn't happen, but it would. There are people who want you to believe you deserve to be mistreated because your body is not what they call the ideal. So when you stand up and say, I like myself and I'm beautiful, or when you stand up and say, my body isn't the ideal, I don't like it every day, but I'm still not gonna let you treat it like shit, that is a direct challenge to their power and to their power over you. So, yes,
I think that's well
activism.
said. Elise, I want to just really agree with what you said about how we like the idea of like your truest self being something we should applaud. And we like it in theory, but we like it a lot less when it's in your face talking about it. Like I'm in the video game industry, and I have burned endless bridges this year calling out our systematic, horrible sexism. I'll give you an example. I've critiqued Giant Bomb 1 trillion times on NPR, Washington Post, like everywhere you can imagine, because they've never hired a woman in their entire history as an organization. And I've talked about that very directly. So they will say in principle that they like the idea of women in the industry, but they sure don't like being called out on it and having that said. So I do think being your most true self is a really, really big challenge for all of us. I'm thinking about how much everyone says they love Jessica Jones. I'm thinking how many feminist Jessica Jones I know that aren't liked because they show that same behavior in the real world. And it's just that double standard. I think the other thing I would say with this is, this ties over to, I want to give you a little bit of pushback when you use the word choice, talking about Caitlyn Jenner's choice to transition. That wasn't a choice for her. Transgender people generally reach a point where it's transition or die because there is so much discrimination involved. I've seen people who love their children with everything they have, love their spouse with everything that they have, get to a point where they are putting a shotgun in their mouth and trying to get the courage to pull the trigger because they hurt so much on a daily basis. And then reaching inside of themselves, finding that strength to go get medical help for a medical condition and losing everything. So, that is, to me, one of the most stark, inspirational examples of someone reaching inside of themselves for that strength to be their most true self. And I don't think that's a choice.
I appreciate the clarification.
Yeah.
I didn't actually notice that I used that word, and I think it comes back to how important it is that we're mindful of the words we use. So
Absolutely.
I very much appreciate that you pointed that out.
Yeah.
Kim, were you going to say something?
Oh, I was just going to say, it's not a choice. 41% of trans people attempt suicide.
Yep.
Attempt suicide. Out of all the violence, out of all of the violence against LGBT people, 3/4 of it is against trans people. 3/4 of that, actually 67%, 2/3 of that is trans women of color. I mean, it's just, these are really important issues, and there's an epidemic going on right now that we need to address and talk about.
Yeah.
The most shocking statistic that I read was actually that the average lifespan of a trans woman is 35 years.
Yeah.
I think that's for a trans woman of color in New York City.
Okay.
Yeah.
That was absolutely haunting to me.
It's something to think about. And the homelessness rates for transgender teens are horrific.
Yeah.
So,
Well, that brings me to my final question for you all before we take questions from the audience, which is, I would love to know when using ally as a verb, what is one thing that everyone in this room can do to be a better ally? And I would love for you to name one person or organization or resource where people can become better informed, because Google is free.
Google is free.
Brianna, I'm going to start with you.
Absolutely. There's a website called Black Game Devs. We talk a lot in the game industry about the discrimination against women. We don't talk at all about the discrimination against black people. And for me as an ally, I've definitely had my consciousness raised this year and realized I have a part to play in, when I do work on diversity and I try to get our industry to do better. Women are 3% of programmers in our field, but black people are like a fraction of a percent of programmers in our industry. So I would say if you want to be a better ally, just saying you believe in something is not enough. And you need to find one area of your privilege that you can make a difference on. I'm on a very popular network for podcasting called Relay.fm. This is kind of the heart of the tech conversation. I have a hell of a lot of conversations with our management team there about bringing in more black, bringing in more Latino, bringing in these different perspectives, because we are so overwhelmingly white. So I think it's not enough to say you believe in something. I think you have to put your oar in the water and row.
One resource.
Yeah. It's blackgamedevs.com.
Great.
Yeah.
Ash.
Sorry, I'm thinking really hard right now. Probably too hard. I would say the best thing you can do, as an ally is disabuse yourself of the notion that you have any answers about identities you do not inhabit. That is basically the first step, is to stop assuming. Get rid of what is really a cultural addiction to certainty. There are things you don't know, and there are even more things that aren't your business. And that's okay. What you are curious about, do not force other people in your life to explain to you. If you want to have a conversation, or if somebody wants to have a conversation with you, I don't think it's ever wrong to approach someone who you are already in relationship with and ask them if it's something that they want to talk about, are willing to talk about with you, if you have questions. But no one owes you answers to their own life, and no one who speaks to you can speak for an entire community. You are going to have to live and experience and study, and it is hard, and it is going to hurt sometimes, but you will be better, and that is going to have to be worth it. As far as some a resource or something, I am a big fan of two things. One of them, I don't know if she's going to do it this year. I think she is, though. Every year, Janet Mock, or at least for the past 2 years, Janet Mock has done a trans book drive where she raises money for incarcerated trans people. And she sends them books that are written by other trans people and that are written about the trans experience, or are written just like memoirs, biographies, like all sorts of things, or fiction books that are written by trans people. They're not just like, this is what it's like to be trans, because they're like, yeah, I know. It's all sorts of literature, and I do believe that study and that books, and probably because I write, and from personal experience, I do believe they save lives. And so I love the fact that she does this drive and sends these packages out to trans people who are incarcerated, because trans incarceration rates are also not just ridiculous, but the treatment of trans people, specifically trans women, who are incarcerated usually for defending themselves from violence. The treatment of them is abhorrent. So that's one thing. There's also a website called Everybody's Gay. And it's not really about the fact that everybody's gay. You might not be gay, and that's okay, we still love you. But it's a really fantastic website and a resource specifically a lot of times for parents who have children in their life or young people in their life who are exploring sexual identities or gender expressions. And it gives them a lot of information about just some basics so that when they have that conversation with you or when you approach that conversation with them, you are having it from a place of foundation, of foundational knowledge, instead of, asking them things that they sit there like you're kidding, right? It'll just help things.
Gay.
It's called Everybody's Gay.
Perfect.
It's perfect.
We're gonna check it out. Thank you.
Kind of picking up on that, on this everybody's gay thing, I think everybody has a gender. And I mean, I'm stating the obvious here. There's a lot of heads nodding out there. I think it helps all of us to think about how that's constructed. Now, I'm sitting here at Feminist.com panel. There are a lot of people in here who have spent a lot of time thinking about that. And that's probably why you're at this panel. It can only help to just keep that momentum going when it comes to thinking about trans issues, when it comes to thinking about issues of people who are gender nonconforming or gender queer or have even more, we're kind of on a polarized kind of gender binary system that we're, in some ways perpetuating here. At least that's how I would identify myself. But there's plenty of people who find themselves in that big, beautiful spectrum of gender that we, I think, need to consider more and more. This is not to say that we're out to erase the poles of gender. It's just to say that, like Eskimos have however many names of snow, that we need to just get more accurate in the way that we think about these things. I think a really good ally is Melissa Harris Perry. She has been really good about talking about a lot of these issues. And I think just embodies it. She has a voice. She's been using that voice in a way that she really didn't have to go to any of these issues in the way that she did. So yeah, Melissa Harris Perry.
I suppose that to echo pretty much everyone, just do your research. If you have a question, hopefully you have a friend of a friend that you can confide in. But I think in terms of great resources, the theme of humanization and humanizing these experiences has come up quite a bit, and I think that's what has been the most beneficial for me. I have a great friend who went through a transition. He now identifies as a man, and I had no idea. I mean, I really had no idea. I thought I knew, but I didn't have any inclination of what it meant to go through that type of transition until I'm sitting in a nurse's office learning how to give him a shot of testosterone. And his name is King Texas. He's a photographer. He's a really phenomenal artist. And I think in terms of humanization, just familiarizing yourself with his work and his experiences and my experience with him as his friend has been one of the most beneficial educational experiences that I've ever had. He's just really talented, so you should check him out. Google King Texas. Also, from a perspective that's foreign to mine as a parent, because I don't have kids, fortunately, is it's a joke. Is that there's a wonderful journalist writer named Jodi Patterson, and she has a trans-identifying son, and she talks very openly and very candidly about her experiences having a trans child and her fears in having a trans child, her worries, and also the joys and the day-to-days of just being a kid. And so I think it's a really beautiful how she talks about her experience as a mother of a trans child as well. So Jodi Patterson and King Texas, I think, are two great people to familiarize yourself with.
Can I add something onto that? If y'all are in a position where you can hire someone who is trans or gender nonconforming, hire somebody who's trans or gender nonconforming, because the economic issues, we're talking about all these intersecting ideas, but they're really, really important. And at the risk of ending with a negative, Well, let's just put it this way. One time I was given a keynote, and there were all these people at the nice, meal, and they were eating and drinking wine, and the glasses are clinking and stuff. And they had me get up and talk about these trans issues, and I said, okay, the first thing we're going to do is turn to the person to your right and introduce yourself. And they all introduced themselves. And I said, okay, now spend the next, I think we have 4 or 5 minutes. I want you to just talk about going to the bathroom and genitals. Go. And it was a really awkward, awesome, very awkward pause before they figured out that this is just not, it's similar to a lot of things that she was talking about it's what I think, if you're trans, people want to talk about that stuff all the time. It's like getting hung up on the bathroom thing is going to be an issue. I don't know how many people were following this LGBT discrimination laws that they were trying to pass in Houston at the city council that got overturned because this is going to be the new wedge. You're going to have men in the girls' bathroom. That's what it's going to be. So we can figure this out. We can work it out. Just if you are going to lead in with those conversations with trans people, I would encourage you to find other things to talk about.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So before we start the Q&A, I just wanted to say quickly, originally this panel was going to be moderated by the fabulous Sally Cohn, and even though I'm amongst friends, I was extremely nervous as a white, cis, straight woman of privilege to be moderating this panel, and I couldn't have felt more supported and more warmth and more love from each of you, and you let me ask really crazy questions and gave me answers and resources and all sorts of fun stuff, although I did a lot of homework, I have to say. So I really appreciate all of you bringing yourselves and your hearts and your thoughts to this panel. I'm truly moved. And with that, I would love to take some questions if anyone has one.
Hi, I'm working on a one-person show with a transgender man who later in life and was a singer-songwriter as a woman, and it's really the story of a life. And I'm helping with the press, and we're sort of framing the press release and how do we talk about this, how do we put this within the transgender conversation, but not make that all that the show is about, because the show is about family, it's about life, it's about the death of a child, it's about a career, all of these other things. So I just wanted to bring that up and see if you had any insight on how to make it, how to be in that conversation, but not make it the only conversation.
Good luck. I mean, that's, I was on Oprah, and it was that, it's changing these, the extent to which people want to focus on that as being the only issue in the room. That's shifting. I think it's a little bit better now than it was even 6 months ago, a year ago. I kind of said with my strategy with the storytelling that I do is I think you just always have to find ways to bring it back to all the underlying issues of humanity that don't have anything to do with the other stuff. They're going to take that gender stuff in whichever way they're going to take it, but you have control of focusing on the storytelling from that point of view. So I think you should just focus on that, and not try to turn that train around.
Well said.
I would offer really quickly too, the fabulous Pete Nowak, who's the showrunner for How to Get Away with Murder, just did an episode a couple episodes ago, which had a storyline that included a trans character, but I think to your point, it was not the plot, it was a subplot or a part of an overarching story, and he had many of the questions that you had, he often talks about the ways that he informs his work in interviews, so I would just suggest finding that episode and then seeing if I know actually he worked with Janet on it some, but I think it might just be worth seeing if he'd said anything in the press about what his process was like.
There's also a really good resource. it's kind of the only one out there. Let me know if there's a better one, but GLAD, they call it a media resource guide. That's going to be really helpful for you to point those different press outlets to, so that they can figure out how to talk about former pronouns and stuff like that, which phrases to avoid.
And I know not everybody digs them, but BuzzFeed has a guide as well, and they update it constantly. And sometimes I think, despite how people think of BuzzFeed, when it comes to things like that, they really are at the forefront of writing about these things and talking about these things in a way that normalizes them instead of sensationalizes them.
Yep.
Vanessa?
Hi, I'm Vanessa, and I work as a birth worker, a doula, and a childbirth educator. Most of my clients have been heterosexual, but I'm just wondering if any of you have a direction or a need for resources for reproductive health and rights for transgender people.
You should probably start some.
Yeah.
To be perfectly honest, this is something that I was looking up not too long ago and trying to do some research on because someone did I saw a really great, actually on BuzzFeed, they had done some of like the best maternity photos or something like that, and a couple of them were just like trans folks who were pregnant, and I suddenly realized that I had no idea what it would be like to be trans and pregnant, how you would find a doctor, how that doctor, because doctors say dumb stuff to people all the time. If you're a queer woman who's been pregnant and go to a doctor and they keep insisting like, well, who is the father, and stuff like that, like it's tough. So I think sometimes when people ask questions like that, my first thought is, and if you guys know of anything, like please put it out there. But my first thought is always like, you should, if you have the question, like it's a great opportunity for you to jump in and start like doing some research and creating something.
So Lux, whose last name eludes me, one of the co-founders of BinderCon, is actually doing a video series on those issues. And I'm happy to put you, it's like a series of videos that are all about different things that are in the sexual and reproductive health and rights field, specifically related to the trans community, which have yet to be addressed. And I'm happy to put you in touch with her. And then also, if you're here for the day, I believe Karen Spruck from Planned Parenthood is coming, and I'm happy to connect you with her. She may have some thoughts as well.
Excellent.
Healthcare is really tough. The whole system is set up for the very first question they ask is this male or female? And we're kind of blowing their minds. So I would just say one really good resource here in town is Callan Lord. And I don't know of any programs that they have going on for those issues in particular, but they will be some of the leading thinkers in this as it comes to healthcare, I think.
Excellent.
Hi, my name is Jennifer. I'm a graduate student at Queens College and also an HIV AIDS advocate. And I just wanted to give 2 points of information that just came up in the room. I was at World AIDS Day at Roosevelt Hospital. And so 2 things. One, they announced on the tour that Roosevelt Hospital is going to open, I'm not sure which location because Mount Sinai is everywhere now, it's like the board. But they're going to open a transgender-focused center with some of the issues, including, I think, reproductive health being addressed. And I think they have a goal of 35 gender reassignment surgeries in the first year, and they provide mental health services and all that. I'm not sure if they, anyone wants to talk to me, I'm not sure if I will find that out. The other thing, suddenly escaped me, the other thing here. I think they're all sorry.
Is there any other questions in the back?
Hi, I'm Liz. Thank you so much for being open and outspoken with, your stories. But at the beginning of the talk, I took a photo and tweeted it, listing the title of the talk and the handles that everyone has it there. And I got a response, I guess, to what makes a woman, and it was a man who said a bunch of, and then he listed a bunch of organs, like a bunch of ovaries, fallopian tubes, etc., as a response to the title of the talk. So I guess my question is, one, how have you dealt with sort of offensive comments, foundationally dumb comments, or even threats that you've received? Do you have advice for people in the audience? be amazing.
Sure.
And then the second is, if you could have a resource to deal with those types of comments online or things that you experienced online, what would they be?
I'm generally unbothered by anyone who doesn't love me or pay me. If that's not what's happening, then I don't really. On the other hand, I don't get as much in general, despite being obviously very outspoken. For some reason, I've been able to sort of not get hate in the way other women have. So these things happen, and they do come at me, and I get weird emails, and I get weird tweets and stuff like that. I generally quickly block it like it's hot. I don't care.
Yep.
And if I see someone harassing someone else, I block them preemptively.
Yep.
I do that all the time, so that might be part of the reason why I haven't received hate in a certain way, or at least in not a relentless way. It is not something that happens to me every day, I would say that. But it is happening to a lot of women I know every single day and constantly. And the only thing that I can think of, that one of the things that they need is really just a space to operate and feel safe. Like, that's it. And they need to be able that if someone like creates a profile and harasses you, sometimes it's not enough to just block that person. You need to be able to say, like, this person needs to be on some kind of list.
Yeah.
Like, this person, this is not okay. These are real threats. And I think that sometimes these social tools that we use don't take those complaints seriously. And then that person just creates 10 profiles and harasses you 10 different ways all day.
I have a lot to say about this issue, interestingly enough. So as far as what can you do in response to this, believe me, I've tried it all. I have tried arguing with them, I've tried name calling, I've tried reasoning, I've tried ignoring, I've tried every single tactic that exists, and I get death threats constantly. I get doxxed almost every day of the week. I have to carry 2 phones these days because this is how often my phone number gets leaked. So, this is a really serious problem. The best course of action I've found is exactly what you do. You block. If there's a chance for education, especially if that person is in a position of privilege, because I run into this all the damn time in the game industry, of men in our field that are in a position of privilege, that talk over women's voices in our field, that tell us what our value is, that tell us what lived experiences we're able to voice. You have, or at least I feel, a moral responsibility to check them on that and to have a conversation about that. I do want to back up a bit and get to the core of your question. And I think what we are discovering right now as a society is all too often throughout history, I think the definition of womanhood has been defined by white women and white feminism. I would hope everyone in this room here today understands how much of a problem white feminism is. In that same vein, I would strongly argue that cisgender women do not have the only perspective on what it's like to be a woman. I would imagine, like, if you go through life and, like, if you transition and then you are suddenly experiencing, like, sexism from the other side, that's a very rich perspective on what it's like to be a woman. So, and I think transgender people are sometimes guilty of this as well. I've been very, very, very uncomfortable with some of the conversations I've seen this week with Planned Parenthood and reproductive rights to see transgender, women kind of inserting themselves in that conversation. Like, how dare you say all women have a vagina? It's not polite to kind of insinuate yourself into a situation and make it about you when it's not about you. So I think my overall point would be intersectional feminism is about all of our perspectives mattering. Transgender women, cisgender women, straight women, lesbian women, bisexual women, white women, Latina women, all of us together. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind.
That is the absolute perfect ending.
Yay!
Thank you so much to all our panelists.